A big thank you to Bombas for sponsoring today's episode. These are hands down the most comfortable socks I've ever worn, and now I can sport these cozy slippers all winter too. Comfort aside, my favorite part about Bombas is that for every pair purchased, one is donated, and they've donated over 150 million items. They have a 100% happiness guarantee, so you know you're going to love what you get. Feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing your purchase is doing some real good. New customers get 20% off their first purchase. Just go to bombas.com/Babish and use code Babish20 at checkout. Alright, so the first thing to consider with tonkatsu is the ton, or pork. There are a number of different cuts that you could use, but today we're going to be focusing on probably the most popular option, thick-cut boneless pork chops. The porcine equivalent of a boneless ribeye, pork chops typically have a cap of fat and silver skin, which during cooking contracts, causing the dreaded pork chop curl. This doesn't bother some folks, but if it bothers you, you have the ability and the right to fix it. The easiest solution is to simply trim it off, especially if your chops are very lean and there isn't much delicious fat to lose. The way to preserve the fat and by extension flavor is to place shallow cuts down the length of the fat cap. You want to go just deep enough that you barely start to see meat. This effectively separates the silver skin into sections and prevents it from being able to deform the chop when it contracts. Rinse and repeat with all of your intended pork pieces, and then it's time to both flatten and tenderize. The no tools required approach means flipping over your knife and using its spine to very gradually pound out the pork, rotating 90 degrees and flipping frequently to ensure uniform tenderization. This, however, requires a whole lot of time and elbow grease. What you're seeing here is a chop that I pounded for 3 minutes non-stop, and it's not even thin enough, so making dinner for 4 is going to take a while. Much easier method is to cover with plastic wrap and use a meat mallet or just a heavy bottom saucepan to pound out the pork the same way that you would chicken. But if you really want to be a badass about it, it's time to bust out that chicken fried steak tenderizer that's been collecting dust since the last time you made chicken fried steak. This thing repeatedly pierces the meat with about 24 needle-like knives, both pounding out the pork and effectively pre-chewing the meat for you, ensuring that it will be tender enough to cut with a butter knife. No matter how you pound it, in the end we're looking to both widen and flatten the chop, I'd say about 50% in both dimensions. Once the pork's all pounded, it's time to engage in a best practice for virtually any meat, a quick or slow dry brine, gently sprinkling both sides of the chop with a pinch of kosher salt, then letting them sit at room temperature for about 45 minutes or 4 to 24 hours covered up in the fridge. This is going to deeply season and tenderize the meat, not to mention help it retain moisture. Then when it comes time to put the katsu back in tonkatsu, we're going with the standard 3-station breading setup. First, beating together 3 or 4 eggs with a pinch of salt and a splash of water. This helps denature the proteins in the eggs or something, which gives you a smoother mixture with fewer streaks of yolk and white. Sometimes I also like to add a little bit of flour to the eggs. Might be superstition more than anything else, but I feel like it helps the eggs stick to the flour better. Speaking of which, here comes our pork, which we patted dry before generously and evenly coating with flour, and then generously and evenly coat with egg. Take your time here, flip the pork a couple times. Sometimes dry patches like to pop up and they will ruin the integrity of your crust. Once it's assuredly gooey, we're then pressing into a pan of panko breadcrumbs. And I do mean press. These are big, flaky breadcrumbs, and we need both large ones to stick and smaller ones to fill in the gaps, so don't be afraid to really squish them in there. Once everybody's breaded, as soon as possible we want to fry. Letting these guys sit around for too long might mean their crust falls off more easily. For frying fat, I'm going with my favorite blend, half lard, half peanut oil, both of which I feel like impart more color and flavor. And as you can see, I'm using a wok, which is a great deep frying vessel. We're shooting for a temperature between 350 to 375 degrees Fahrenheit. I like to go just a smidgen shy of 375 so the meat has a smidgen more time to cook. In it goes, and there it shall fry for 3 to 5 minutes. Make sure to give it a little stir and flip it once every minute or so, ensuring that it cooks evenly and nothing browns too quickly on the bottom of the pan. Once the crust looks good and golden brown, we're going to take it out and put it on a wire rack set in a rim baking sheet. Just like fried chicken, if the crust browned too fast and the pork didn't cook all the way through, you can finish these guys off in a 275 degree Fahrenheit oven. Make sure to sprinkle with kosher salt while they're still hot so the salt sticks. So that's our pork done and dusted. What about accoutrement? Well, the simplest of sides for tonkatsu is a big fluffy pile of thinly shaved cabbage, which we're going to make all the more crisp and delicious by soaking in ice water for up to 30 minutes before serving. This is generally a great way to refresh wilted leafy greens, and it makes for an ultra cold, ultra crisp salad. All you gotta do is dry it off with some paper towels or a salad spinner, and the most Spartan way to serve is with nothing more than a couple lemon wedges. Hardly need any more than that because the star of our show is so god dang crisp, flavorful, and juicy. Let's listen in. That is the sound of a properly executed deep fried crust. All we need now is a little bit of tonkatsu sauce, readily available at most grocery stores. It's a tangy, savory, punchy sauce that I personally think goes very well with sweet potato fries. But there you have it. Tonkatsu. Crisp, juicy, flavorful, and mostly homemade. And critically, it's tender enough that you can take a bite out of it without fighting it whatsoever. As for the cabbage, with little more than a squeeze of lemon, it's just cabbage with lemon on it, but that's fine. It's practically just a palate cleanser between bites of pork. So that's how to make a basic tonkatsu, but what if we want to make a not so basic tonkatsu? Well, for more reasons than one, we're going to start by making our own homemade shokupan, or Japanese milk bread, the fluffiest, chewiest, richest sandwich bread in all the land. First, we're going to make a milk and flour paste called a tangzong, which helps the bread stay soft and fluffy. Combining 75 grams of bread flour with 135 grams of whole milk, mixing to combine, and microwaving for 15-second intervals, stirring between each until it forms a paste with the consistency of Play-Doh. Allow it to cool for 1 or 2 minutes before placing the bowl of a stand mixer, along with 720 more grams of bread flour. Using your fingers, break it up into little pieces, almost like you're rubbing butter into flour to make pie dough. Once the flour has a rough, crumbly consistency, we're going to start adding all the rest of the stuff. 45 grams of granulated white sugar, 7.5 grams each instant yeast and kosher salt, 90 grams of heavy cream, 60 grams of honey, and I almost forgot 405 additional grams of milk. Go ahead and mix that together for 3 to 5 minutes using the dough hook until it comes together to form a tight, smooth ball. Then, not unlike a brioche, we're going to start adding butter, 45 grams worth, one little piece at a time. If the butter's cold, you can crush it between your fingers to soften it, but you want to make sure that it's fully incorporated before adding the next piece. At this point, you should have significant gluten development, and the dough should easily pass the window pane test. Grab a little chunk and see if you can stretch it thin enough that it becomes translucent. Next up, plop out the dough, stretch it out into another smooth, taut ball. Hit the mixing bowl with a little bit of oil and place it back in the bowl. Cover with plastic wrap and let proof at room temperature for about an hour or until it's doubled in size. Plenty of time to start buttering our loaf pan, a straight-sided Pullman pan with a removable top. Make sure you get every nook and or cranny. Then once the dough has doubled, we're going to turn it out onto our work surface and divide it equally into 4 pieces, using a scale so as to be precise. Mine came out to about 1,475 grams, so that means 368.75 grams per piece. They call me the human calculator so long as I'm near a phone or computer. Stretch each of those pieces into yet another taut, smooth ball and place them shoulder to shoulder in the loaf pan, making sure the two in the center aren't too squished or vice versa. Cover it up and let it rise until the dough has filled about 80% of the pan. Then we're sending the covered loaf pan into a preheated 375-degree Fahrenheit oven for just about 45 minutes until the loaf is golden brown and its thickest point registers between 200 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit. Now this guy needs to get out of the pan as fast as possible. As I discovered in a recent episode, trapped moisture will cause the sides of the loaf to cave in. Once you got it out, allow it to cool completely at least 4 hours before slicing and doing stuff with it. The first of which is to make nama panko, or fresh, not dried breadcrumbs. This is achieved simply enough by cutting the bread into thick slices, removing the crust, and then breaking the so-called bread meat, as Kendall calls it, down into 1-inch cubes. Cubes small enough to be processed by the appropriately named food processor. In batches if necessary, these guys are getting processed down into what you might call crumbs of bread, or bread crumbs for short. I should point out that this is not how panko is traditionally made, but it is the closest at-home equivalent, and definitely the only way to get something like nama panko in your hot little hands. It feels pretty unusual to fry in fresh breadcrumbs, but it makes for an unparalleled crust. It's what I saw them doing at the justifiably famous Tonkatsu Maisen in Tokyo. Next up, we're doing something decidedly untraditional and marinating our pork in buttermilk. But to this about 1 cup of buttermilk, we're going to add some Japanese flavors. 1 or 2 tablespoons each mirin, rice wine vinegar, and soy sauce, plus a generous pinch of kosher salt. The enzymes and acids in this marinade are going to break down the muscle fibers of the pork, giving us an unbelievably tender and juicy end product. Normally I like to borderline over marinate, but in this case you should go at least 2 hours and no more than 12. Otherwise this already tenderized pork will turn into mush. Next up on our list of things to upgrade is the cabbage, for which I'm going to make a simple toasted sesame dressing. Toasting about 1/4 cup of sesame seeds, processing about half that in a mortar and pestle into a rough paste, and mixing that with 2 tablespoons of Kewpie mayo, 1 teaspoon rice wine vinegar, 1 teaspoon soy sauce, and a ½ teaspoon of toasted sesame oil, plus the remaining toasted sesame seeds and about 1 teaspoon of granulated sugar, which is going to come together to make a dressing that you'll want to put on everything. Cabbage, carrots, Flintstones, vitamins, the works. Next up, the tonkatsu sauce, which I don't really think is worth making from scratch, but if you feel like doing it, combine 2 parts ketchup to 1 part each oyster sauce and plain white sugar. There are way more from scratch recipes from tonkatsu sauce. Check out Alvin's video, click the link in the upper right hand corner right now. But just like ketchup, I think making it at home yields diminishing returns. Anyway, now it's game time for our pork, which we're going to rinse the marinade off of and press dry. We want as little moisture as possible going underneath the flour layer in our breading process. This is going to help the breading adhere to the pork, and then it's business as usual, albeit with our fresh nama panko, which is a little tricky to work with, as the bigger, chunkier breadcrumbs make it more difficult to evenly coat the pork, and if you press it too much, you're going to squish the breadcrumbs. So maybe do this in a bowl or something where you can really toss it around. Whatever you can do to ensure even and prolific adhesion to the pork. Once that's done, we're headed into the same mixture of lard and peanut oil, where this guy's going to fry for the same 3 to 5 minutes or until done. This is a more delicate breading, so you ideally don't want to finish off in the oven. Luckily, all the extra moisture in the bread should help things brown more slowly, and the big delicate crumbs make for an unbelievably lacy, light, and crisp fried pork. Serve alongside miso soup, steamed rice, Japanese pickles, and of course a generously dressed cabbage salad, slicing and saucing up our pork cutlet before serving. And there you have it, a fussy but unparalleled tonkatsu experience. The pork is frankly unbelievable. The crust is shatteringly crisp, and the meat is almost uncomfortably juicy. But we're not quite done exploring all the tonkatsu abilities, if you will. I hope you hung on to half of that shokupan, because next up we're making an outrageous tonkatsu sando. First buttering and toasting a couple slices of our shokupan, crust removed, and we're only toasting it on one side, adding crunch to the inside of the sandwich and keeping the outside soft and pillowy. Next up, I want to put a Nashville hot chicken spin on this sandwich. Normally this starts with a cayenne and sugar spice mixture toasted in the deep frying fat, but instead I'm going to use togarashi, a Japanese mixture of dried chilies, sesame seeds, and seaweed, which I think is going to play real nice with a few ladlefuls of hot fat. Combine the two in a heat-proof bowl, let the spices toast, and while both the pork and the spice mixture are still hot, brush one over the other. The hot oil doesn't absorb into the crust as much, which means it stays crisp. Be sure to scoop up as many of the toasted spices as you can in the process. To serve, we're spreading both sides of the bread with our tonkatsu sauce, topping the cutlet with some of our chili, deliciously dressed cabbage, and that's all there is to it, a pork katsu sando with Nashvilleian curiosities. Let's saw it in half and take a look at that cross section, and you can see that the breading has separated from the pork a little bit. I think that's because I had to keep this guy warm in the oven while I finished off the katsu set. So make sure you dig in as soon as possible. But also, I mean, just look at how juicy this pork is. Let's listen into what I have to say about it.
Look at how juicy that is. Dear God.
Yeah, the marinade really truly did its job. This is a recipe very much worth trying yourself, so I hope you guys give it a try. I hope you play around with the different methods outlined here, and I hope you enjoyed this very special live audio version of Basics with Babish. Let me know what you want to see and hear next time.